Trump is the first president to, I think, who will weaponize trade, in other words, access to U.S. markets as a policy tool to get other countries to do what he wants them to do.
The Trump Risk Index, developed by a leading US think tank, assesses the likelihood of tariffs on US allied nations. Professor Robert Atkinson, the think tank's founder, explains the rationale behind the assessment.
Somebody emailed me yesterday and he said, I've shared this with the Trump transition team, which who knows what that means. What we did with this study is we looked at 4 different factors. How much of your GDP is spent on defense? What's your trade balance with the US? Do you have a lot of specific problematic trade practices, particularly with regard to high tech in the US? And then finally, what are you willing to be tough on China? And so it's not intended to say, oh, if you're at the top in terms of badness, in terms of bad score, you're going to be, feel the wrath of Mr. Trump. But one of the things it does say is these are the sorts of things that the Trump administration will be looking for. They'll be looking for these kinds of things. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States saw itself as having a mission to advance democracy, advance free markets, advance global trade, particularly against the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union still existed. And so, our foreign policy was always one of willing to put our interests second, at least some interest second, for this broader mission, this broader global mission. That was the core mission of the U.S. It wasn't to defend the U.S. directly. It was to create this world. And I think those days are gone. Biden tried to bring them back, but at the end of the day, he lost, number one, and he didn't do a very good job of doing that, partly because U.S. capabilities of doing that are a lot weaker than they used to be, particularly with regard to China. Other countries they can work with China, they can work with the U.S., et cetera. So I think what Trump is wanting to do is to say, wait a minute, we have to put America first. Now, does that mean America alone? No, it doesn't mean America alone. Now, Trump is not going to say to our allies or any other country, really, we don't want anything to do with you. That's not what Trump is going to do. But what he is going to do is say, look, you have to play by the rules, and you have to take up some of the load. You have to take to carry some of the load. And we'll see that with regard to NATO countries, where a lot of the NATO countries have underinvested in defense. We'll see it, I think, in trade pushback with not just China, which is what everybody talks about, but with a lot of other countries. You see the Europeans. So I think what you'll see from Trump is a big push for. There's a great movie in the U.S. from the 70s. And there's a great line where it's a sort of like a national news commentator that everybody knows in the country, and he has a show. And finally, he gets so fed up, he yells, "I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore." If you say that in the U.S., it's a famous line. I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore. I think in a lot of ways, that's what you're going to see with Trump. Principally, Trump is the first president to, I think, who will weaponize trade. You've had presidents in the past, the Republican Party before the Second World War, when the Republicans were largely in control of the government from the Civil War in the 1860s to the beginning of the Great Depression, and they used tariffs as a tool to build up U.S. industry. And the Democrats didn't want to do that because they were representing more farming regions, if you will. And then you had the shift after World War II to more open trade. You try to bring down tariffs, ideally to zero. Trump, I think, is going to be the first president to use tariffs, in other words, access to U.S. markets, as a policy tool to get other countries to do what he wants them to do. One of the reasons why that's more likely to happen is not just President Trump, but there's a growing realization that our national power, including our military power, depends upon a strong manufacturing base. for example, China is very, very good at shipbuilding. Has a number of really, I mean, a lot of big shipyards. We don't have very much shipbuilding. Our steel industry has been weakened. Our semiconductors were problematic, which is why we passed the CHIPS Act. So there's going to be a more of an understanding that national power or security comes from you have to have a stronger industrial base, particularly what's called a dual use industrial base, areas that are useful to both the military and the civilian. It's a little bit like what President Xi calls a civil military fusion. It's similar concept. And there's a growing realization that the U.S. has to do more of that. So that's another factor that'll push us in that direction of America first. He's not the president yet, but he recently threatened both Mexico and Canada with retaliatory tariffs if they didn't, number one, deal with the problem of the drug fentanyl coming across the border, which is mostly from Mexico, and also illegal immigration. And he said, if you don't fix this or help us fix it, we're going to impose tariffs on you two countries. And what was striking was very, very quickly, the president of Mexico, the new president of Mexico, Xi, said, yes, absolutely, we will do this. And so that's a weapon that the administration has. And in some ways, it's he shouldn't have to use it, but he does. There's no reason why Mexico, for example, should have been so enabling of so much illegal immigration into the U.S. They didn't do anything really at the end of the day. I don't know about illegal drugs. I don't think they've done very much on illegal drugs. And so now Trump is saying, hey, if you want access to our market, you got to fix these problems. And it appears, at least in the case of Mexico, that they said, okay, we will. Now, where that's going to go, are they going to do it, whatever, I don't know. So I think what you'll see is some of that. You'll see just saying, hey, we don't like what you're doing. You better fix it or else we'll impose tariffs. It's not clear what, Trump had this idea of we're going to put tariffs on everybody and then higher tariffs on China. It's not clear that if that's going to happen, or is he only going to put tariffs on countries that run trade deficits with us? Or is he going to use that as a threat for countries to change their policies? But I wouldn't be surprised if you see across the board tariffs coming from the U.S. I think that seems to be their main focus. I have a piece coming out soon comparing tariffs with currency reduction. So the U.S. dollar is, in my view, and many people's views, is overvalued. It makes imports cheaper, exports more expensive. And President Reagan, back in the 80s, he negotiated a currency revaluation with the Japanese and the Europeans, which was very effective. For some bizarre reason, Trump isn't going to do that. He recently threatened the BRICS, Brazil, India, China, South Africa, Russia, with 100% tariffs if they decide they want to strengthen, either use a joint currency or use the RMB, which I thought was the worst idea possible. It definitely is in the U.S. interest, in my view, for other countries for there being another currency besides the dollar, because then it means the dollar can fall and it makes our exports more competitive and it makes our imports less competitive. Your imports more or less competitive. But Trump sees the dollar as the way the dollar is termed, it's strong dollar, weak dollar. Well, who wants a weak dollar? I mean, weak is bad, strong is good. So I just think that's sort of a contradiction in the Trump administration. They want to lower the price of exports and raise the price of imports, but they want to do the opposite when it comes to the dollar. So in some ways, what you could see would be, even if they impose tariffs, you could see a neutering of the effect if the U.S. dollar goes up, which it, in all likelihood could go up. So the dollar goes up, the current tariffs go up, and you're in the same situation. That's a little bit what happened to China after we imposed tariffs. You also imposed the same tariffs, more or less. But at the same time, the value of the Chinese RMB fell, and so in some ways you were better off because of that. That made you better off because you had tariffs on our products and the RMB fell, whereas we just had tariffs on your products. So I don't know that the Trump administration is as sophisticated as they should be on this. I think there's a phrase in the US, you're a one-trick pony, which means you have one thing that you want to do. And for Trump, the one-trick pony is tariffs. One of the reasons they're popular is that the among Trump is unlike China or I don't know, Korea or Japan, Singapore, who have, fairly sophisticated, advanced technology and industry policies, because they see that there are certain sectors that they want to grow. So, China wants to grow its biotech sectors, has all these research parks and supports efforts to do that. The Republicans in the U.S., they don't like that. They think somehow that that's a distortion of the free market. And so in their view, why, you don't want to do an industrial policy. The fact that President Trump could be talking about eliminating the CHIPS Act. So the CHIPS Act is grant funding for building chip factories and a tax incentive to do that. The fact that he could be talking about getting rid of that and replacing it with tariffs, which is a terrible idea, it wouldn't work, but it tells you sort of how much they don't like industrial policy. And instead, for them, tariffs are everything. So that's number one. Number two is the U.S. has a very large budget deficit and national debt. And they don't think that they can get Congress, even if they liked industrial policy, they don't think Congress will allocate the money either directly or through tax incentives to industrial policy. So for them, tariffs are easy. You just sign an executive order. You're done. You don't even have to deal with Congress. It doesn't cost you any money. In fact, it raises money. So they've defaulted towards that as the de facto policy.